Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more extra history. We're going to be starting their series on the South Sea Bubble, which apparently relates a little bit to the previous one we did on the history of paper money, which I think is going to be really cool. It's going to make a little bit more sense out of that reference they made in one of the later episodes there. So I'm excited to see where this goes. Economic history, it can be hard, but I want to learn a little bit more. And this is like the early 1700s, and while that's not really in my area of study, it's so close that it is inevitably going to give a little bit more context for the stuff that I actually spend a lot of time studying. So this is really good. As far as being close to my area of study, this is the closest thing we've had since the Articles of Confederation, which is like, that is like my area of study. We are like right there. So this is really cool. I'm very excited. Before we get started, there is a poll on the community tab. So if you go to the channel and then you hit that little tab that says community, you can vote on that and help me determine which extra history series I'm going to be checking out next. So it's going to be like a ranked thing. So whichever one comes in first place, I'm going to do next. Second place, I'll do after that. Third, fourth, fifth, and there's 5 of them. So even if yours does not come first, you can help to make it maybe second or third. If you have an unpopular opinion, it still kind of helps to vote and have your voice heard. So if you're interested in the extra history videos, I would love it if you go over to the community tab and have your voice heard. It's the most democratic thing we can do. All right, so I'm excited to get started with this. I know the South Sea Bubble is a very economic story, and I believe it has something to do with the slave trade. There's like slave monopoly stuff going on there, but beyond that, I don't know it in any significant depth. So I'm glad this is going to be new to me, because the extra history series more or less have been for me to learn new stuff. I have plenty of other people I can check out who cover stuff that's very close to my area of study, but I'm more excited to learn things that I don't already know. So this should be fun. Let's get it started.
Welcome to the 4th installment of Extra History. This time it's going to be a daring tale of high seas, adventure, and romance. Nah, I'm just kidding. This is going to be all about finance and economics. First...
Okay, I mean, that's where the real sexy topics come on, and that's how I usually talk about things. When I'm presenting a topic to like a professor or something, and I know that the topic on its face doesn't sound super exciting, but I think there's some depth to it, I'll be like, I got a real sexy topic for you right here. I'm gonna do a paper on the Quakers. Or it would be more in depth than that, but that's kind of how, and I like that I don't know, it just makes me think of myself presenting my paper topic to someone.
off, I just want to say, I think it's amazing that we get to do this episode. Each month, the Patreon subscribers vote on what the next topic is going to be, and last month we just sort of threw in the South Seas Company topic on a lark. It's important, and it's relevant, but we figured there's no way that it would win out against things like the life of Caesar or the Spanish Inquisition. But delightfully, we were wrong. And that's one of the things that I love about doing this series. Everything from the YouTube comments to the episode suggestions and the votes from the Patreon supporters reflect not the nihilistic internet that people always talk about, but rather a genuine curiosity and a love of history. I desperately want to cover the campaigns of Caesar and dig into the truth about the Spanish Inquisition too, of course, but I think it's pretty awesome that we have an audience that's also interested in something as obscure and esoteric as the South Seas Bubble. So,
I find this very interesting as well, because I did polls to determine the last several series that I did from Extra History, and this one came in last place. And the one that came right before it, the one that beat it out, was the history of paper money. And the difference was like, nobody was suggesting the history of paper money. All the others were popular suggestions. The history of paper money is something that I threw on there because I thought it sounded fun. But that beat out South Sea Bubble, and that kind of is fun when the people kind of go against your expectations. That's why I kind of like doing the polls.
Oh, what is the South Seas Bubble? It is perhaps some of the wildest financial chicanery of the 18th century. And why are we covering it? Well, because it has a lot of parallels with some of the events of the last few years. It gloriously highlights the importance and value of financial institutions, while also serving as a warning about the incredible danger of invented wealth. But before we can talk about the South Seas bubble, we have to talk about the South Seas Company. And before we can talk about the South Seas Company, we have to talk about Great Britain in the early 1700s. First off, there was no Great Britain in the very early 1700s, because until the Act of Union in 1707, England and Scotland were two different countries. But since that's right in the middle of the story that we're about to tell, I'm just going to refer to England as Great Britain throughout, if that's okay. And the first thing to know about our Great Britain is the fact that in the late 17th and early 18th century, it pretty much could not get enough of being at war. Not only did the English go through a major civil war in the 17th century, which I am sure we're going to cover someday, but then they just continued to fight pretty much everybody in Europe for the next 100 years. So with that in mind, I'm just going to start us off in 1710 with a guy...
Yeah, it seemed like they were incredibly interested in war up until we get to like the 7 Years' War. And in America, I have to emphasize that part because I know half of my audience, a little more than half of my audience, is not from the United States. Over here, our version of the 7 Years' War was the French and Indian War. That's just the American version of the conflict because it was just the British fighting against the French and Native Americans, like an alliance between the two of them. So we had that. Up until then, it seemed like the English could not find a war that they did not like. After that, it's like, okay, financially, we are in so much trouble. We just lost a whole bunch of money to that. We need to start raising money, and that's kind of a big part of what triggered a lot of the policies that caused the American Revolution. But it feels like that seems like it's kind of the cutoff where it's like, oh, we don't really want war anymore. And then they started getting wars that they didn't want, like the American Revolution. They didn't want that.
Named Robert Harley. August of 1710 looks like it's going to be a great month for Mr. Harley. Through a bunch of political wrangling, he's just gotten himself appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, a position that's basically the same as the Secretary of the Treasury in the U.S. He's been out of power for a while, but by gum, he's gotten himself back in it now. He's thinking everything is going to be great. Then he looks at Britain's balance sheet. In one column is the £5,000 still remaining in the government treasury, and in the other column is a hastily scrawled note saying somewhere roughly probably around £9 million in big red ink. To give you an idea of just how big this debt is, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that a payment toward this consolidated debt will be made on February 1st of 2015. That red ink is still being paid down today, 300 years later. So with that in mind, you can pretty much imagine the freakout that Harley had when he realized just how impossible his job was.
Yeah, the English at this point are rising to become like the main empire in the New World, and that's a very expensive process. The Spanish, like, they were the number one for a little bit, but their empires, when it starts declining, it's declining for a really, really long time. Like, there's a point where it feels like they're on top of the world, but it ends up becoming a problem a lot quicker than you might think. And the British seem like they're on the rise as well, but you gotta understand, and I'm saying the British as kind of like shorthand as well. So like Great Britain, whatever you want to call it. England in this case, the English emerging empire. It's so difficult to maintain, especially when you think of like how small in the grand scheme of things England is, and you think about all of the land they are going to come to control. And I think that's something huge that should be emphasized. How truly small they are and how much land they end up controlling. It is truly amazing. I have this amazing book around here somewhere. I highly recommend it. Empires of the Atlantic World, J.H. Eliot. It still holds up really well, and it's got some great material on the English and Spanish empires. Like, it can be a little bit of a slog of a read, but it's really good for setting your foundation if you want to learn about Atlantic imperialism. So, that's a thing.
His first task was just to keep the government afloat through the end of the year. Unfortunately, there were a few hurdles between him and doing that. First, there was the problem of government accounting. At the time, Britain had no unified budget, so while everybody knew that they were in debt, until Harley did a thorough investigation, no one quite knew exactly how in debt they were. This meant that no real preparation had been done, and since every government department had its own budget and carried its own debts, even after doing a deep dive on the books, even Harley could only give a ballpark estimate of how much debt they really had to tackle. Second problem, the House of Commons was a deeply partisan two-party body. For the last few years, the Parliament had been controlled by the Liberal Whigs, with the Conservative Tory minority routinely blocking any legislation from the opposite side of the House. Well,
I'm happy that this is England at this point because, like, there's a lot of language that crosses over. Like, it's not all perfect, but these are all, like, terms that I'm familiar with. We're gonna have, like, our own Whigs and Tories during the age of the American Revolution. Though those terms are going to mean something else, we get to kind of set the foundation for a lot of the terminology that I do kind of throw around willy-nilly when learning about the early American Republic and, like, the early, like, building of, like, the American identity and such.
Well, now the Tories had come into power, and you better believe the Whig minority was going to do the same thing to them. Of course, in response, the Tories were busy calling for the impeachment of members of the previous Whig government, and all of this just made raising taxes a near impossibility. With taxation as a revenue stream cut off, Harley turned to the next viable option to keep the government running, the Bank of England. The Bank of England, though, was created by the Whigs and was a Whig-controlled institution. In fact, this is the beginning of the age of central banking. The Bank of England was really the first institution of its kind, a bank specifically designed to lend money to the government and make sure the government remained solvent. But since most of the board members of the Bank of England were Whigs, and Harley was a Tory, the bank was none too quick to help the government out. This left only foreign creditors as a possible source of revenue for the government, but given how deeply in debt the government already was, and how many people it was still fighting, outside credit wasn't really available. So, with no other options left to him, Harley turned to less orthodox sources, namely John Blunt of the Hollow Sword Blade Company. Despite Blunt being an odd name for one of the fellows in charge of a company which held the monopoly on making fine swords, our Mr. Blunt possessed a sharp financial mind and very few, if any, scruples. He saw the government's critical...
Sorry, I love ironic names like that. That's really fun. I'm starting to... This is going to be it's always difficult when you're entering a period with a bunch of people alive that you're not really familiar with. Like, every once in a while when I'm covering one of these series that I don't know, like, I'll get a name or two, and I'm curious if I'm actually going to be able to identify many major figures that are going to be involved in this, because I really don't understand how much of the foundation of this I really know.
Critical financial state, not as some great national crisis, but rather an opportunity to make money. Lots and lots of money. But he couldn't just sell the government rapiers. No, Blunt needed cold, hard cash. So he dreamed up a scheme so convoluted it's kind of hard to even describe, but I'm going to give it my best shot.
Please
the
try.
real estate market in Ireland was currently up for grabs, as the British government had just confiscated large amounts of Catholic land. Blunt wanted the Hollow Sword Blade Company to buy as much as it could, as cheaply as possible. Unfortunately, the Hollow Sword Blade Company didn't quite have the capital to do that, so they needed to raise some money in a hurry. Normally, you would do this just by selling stock in the company, but Blunt had a much more intricate plan. He offered to trade stock in the Hollow Sword Blade Company for army debentures at under market value to anyone who was willing to make the swap. Now, army debentures were a form of government debt. Basically, they were a promissory note that the army issued when it couldn't afford to, actually pay for things.
And we have so much crossover from from the history of paper money stuff, like having elements like promissory notes and stuff. Like, I know we live in a world where paper money already exists. Of course, we're gonna have that, but when it's just fun going from that to this. I know they made this one first and then they made the history of money, but I'm kind of liking kind of having that and then going to this. It feels a little bit like a sequel.
Problem was, you can't exactly repossess the army's car, so those promissory notes aren't actually backed by anything, making them very hard for people to collect on, which in turn made them nearly worthless. Okay, so at this point you're probably confused. How's the Hollow Sword Blade Company gonna make money by swapping shares in their company at under market value for army debt that most people are just looking to get rid of anyway? Well, Blunt realized that an offer this good was going to entice a lot of people into taking him up on it, thereby massively inflating the demand for, and thus the price of, army debentures. So he very quietly went out ahead of time and had the company quietly buy up as many army debentures as it possibly could before announcing their offer to swap debentures for company shares. That way, when they announced their offer, the value of all the debentures they picked up would go through the roof. On top of that, because the land he was aiming to buy was government held, he could trade the government debt for the land directly at whatever value he'd driven the debt to. This tangly web of financial magic ended up getting him not only the £200,000 he needed to buy land in Ireland, but also another £20,000, which he politely loaned to the government at a very low rate. Now, what Blunt and the Hollow Sword Blade Company did...
All right, that was confusing. I'm gonna be honest. Like, I feel like I kind of get it, but I'm definitely gonna have to rewatch this one before I do the next episode, though, because it's like that element is a little difficult. But I don't know how much the nitty gritty of the situation matters as much as the results. So I guess we'll see how these last couple minutes play out.
Did here is certainly illegal today, and probably was illegal back then, too. In fact, there was even a court ruling against the company, but since they were now busy lending the government money, no action was ever taken against them. After all, when you're busy lending money to the government, who exactly is going to punish you for bending the law? Which is, of course, what got Blunt and Harley together in the first place. Blunt was helping the government find funds, and Harley badly needed funds to be found, so it was high time they take tea. The Bank of England had been running a rather mediocre lottery for the government the last few years, and Harley decided that Blunt was just the man he needed to kick it up a notch. So he got the rights to administer the government lottery turned over to Blunt and his crew. And man, did Blunt do a bang-up job. In 4 days, he sold out all of the tickets, pocketing a tidy profit for himself in the process. He then followed it up with an unbelievably exorbitant lottery with tickets that cost thousands of dollars apiece by today's standards. And he sold out all of those, too. The only problem was that part of the way he did this was by making sure that every ticket won something. At minimum, you were guaranteed to get at least 10% of the price of your ticket back in winnings, which is great for the gambler, but not so great for the government. The key, though, was that...
I mean, like, with how much they cost in total, like, it seems like you'd still be... Maybe I'm missing out on something there, but, like, it still feels like you're going to be getting something. Like, there's still like a massive profit margin, it seems there, unless there's a lot of overhead.
The government would pay out the winnings over the next decade rather than right away, bringing a much-needed influx of cash to the exchequer. So while, yes, this added still more long-term debt the government owed, it gave Harley the £300,000 he needed to see the government through the next few months. But it's going to take way more than just lotteries to solve the larger looming debt crisis. So join us next time for the scheme that Harley and Blunt pulled together to tackle the long-term British debt. A scheme that will be called the South Seas Trading Company.
Okay, like with a lot of these extra history series, the first episode isn't like directly going into as much like the main topic, but will do a lot to build the foundation of the period, because you have to understand kind of the context of the time and the people who are going to be discussed before you can talk about like that initial investment they make into creating the company itself. You got to kind of understand why the company matters. So at least while some of those financial transactions, it would be nice if I had like a flow chart or something. I'm like a flow chart, a huge flow chart fanatic here, so that might be helpful. But I'll probably go back and look at that portion of the video again. But I understand why the company is probably going to matter. Like, it really did lay out how important the issue of the national debt is at this stage. So I get it. I follow. So I'm liking this. This is a decent start. I don't know how it's going to rank next to the other series that I've checked out so far. Now I have a much broader frame of reference when it comes to extra history series. Now I kind of have an idea as to what I can expect quality-wise going into one. So we'll see. I'm wondering how it'll rank next to maybe the History of Paper Money, because I really like that one, but like That's probably the one it's most related to. But this one seems much more specific. That's taken on a very broad topic. This is taken on a much more specific sort of thing. So that's a thing. So I guess we'll see how it goes. Thank you guys for watching. Remember to vote in that poll. It's going to be up probably until I finish the South Sea Bubble series, which I'll be cranking out pretty quickly. So, get around to it, if you want, if you care. If I could just start whatever series and you're like, yeah, that's fine, then I guess it doesn't matter. All right, thank you, and I will see you guys next time. All right.